Welcome to this third Think Cities debate on postcode lotteries and public services. I'm Alexandra Jones, Chief Executive of the Centre for Cities, and delighted to be here today to talk about schools, hospitals and bin men. Would more people win if we had a public services postcode lottery? Joining me in this discussion, I'm delighted that we've got Claudia Wood, Chief Executive of Demos, we've got Sean Worth, who's a consultant in public services, and Paul Buddery, who's the partner at the RSA Public Services 2020. Welcome, all of you. All of you have done a great deal of work on public services in one form or another, different parts of the public sector, projects on what would it look like, how does it need to improve. So a fantastic panel for this debate. And I suppose I'd start off with your general thoughts on the question. Would more people win if we had a postcode lottery? People talk about it all the time as it's a bad thing. Oh dear, if we do that, it'll be a postcode lottery. Actually, would that be better? Or are we better off making sure that standards are the same across the country? And people have the chance to have the same thing wherever they are. What do you?
I mean, postcode lottery is quite a loaded term. It suggests something haphazard. It suggests that there are winners and there are losers, and that this is something that you kind of, it's a game of chance, and depending on where you live, and that in itself is quite a sort of emotive, negative connotation. I don't think localism or the devolution of power to local areas for schools, hospitals and bin men actually means it's a lottery. You can still have consistency of standards and have more responsiveness to local needs. I think one of the kind of tricky bits is marrying the two and thinking about how you actually ensure there is more equality of access, and that you don't have group capture in certain areas that are more affluent than others. And at the same time have more responsive services in a country where we are very unresponsive to local needs. I think talking about postcode lottery kind of polarises something where clearly the answer is somewhere in the middle way.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, obviously we're being deliberately provocative, but I think it's because partly that the debate so often gets boiled right back down to it. So all the nuance you're talking about, the kind of knee-jerk is often, well, postcode lottery, therefore it's bad, it's wrong, almost difference is bad. And Sean, do you feel that?
Yeah, I mean, having worked in politics for about 10 years prior to what I do now, and I always was acutely conscious that there were already massive postcode lotteries everywhere. It's just that the political class don't want that basically to be exposed. So even if you look at something like the NHS, to which there are national entitlements to decent service, you look at the fact that a lot of performance has been, over the last couple of years, been basically revealed to the public in formats they can sort of finally understand. There's massive variations between hospitals. There's not much exposure of GPs yet, but that's coming. You'll see massive variation in the quality of GP services, and these are services that are, people think that basically provided nationally. So I think the question to me is, would more people kind of, do people willingly want this kind of postcode lottery environment where what you really mean is local areas, whether that's authorities or providers, actually accountable for the performance in their area? I think they probably do, but I'm very sceptical of the political will, and this is always the bit that to me has blocked localism and devolution of services for all the years I've looked at it, and people have always been asking for more devolution, but political figures don't want to actually accept the accountability and responsibility that goes with it, because then they will be judged on it. That's the key issue.
Yeah, and I think there is a real tension, is that because if the Secretary of State is judged for the performance of an individual hospital, they won't want to let go completely, even though they're not really in control of some of that. So there's some real tensions there. Paul, I mean, do you see that there are these tensions, that actually people want certain kind of standards, but they're not really getting them, and that kind of diversity that Sean's talked about is very much there already?
Certainly tensions, and I think that they are the substantive issues, as has been said, they're actually being obscured by the language here, really. And we could flip it and talk about postcode democracy instead, which might be a more positive way of coming at it now. It would be a more positive way of approaching the types of differences and the issue of accountability that we've already got on the table. It doesn't by itself answer those. You still have questions about about where that sits best and what type of accountability you are talking about. If you're pushing decision making down to a lower level, is that simply a different type of decision making within your local authority structure? If it's within health, how is that structured so that it is itself accountable locally? So you need to, I think, be quite pragmatic about how you approach all of these. But if the question is, would things be better if things were more local, which is, I suppose, the more underlying, which is the underlying question here, I think that I'll be amongst those who'd say almost certainly for most people, however, for the most vulnerable, you need a settlement and a set of policy and regulatory functions which ensure that those who are most vulnerable are those who don't lose least in that circumstance.
And I suppose this goes back to the point that you've all made in slightly different ways, that there are certain standards that everybody wants. So you want to kind of, if you go to the GP, you want to know that you would get the same treatment as if you were in a neighbouring GP, as fast, as good diagnosis, even if actually in practice that's not really what happens. So you want those kind of standards, but you also want people to be flexible to your needs. And so I suppose there's a couple of things packed in there. There's something about the different sectors, isn't there? So health is much more emotive, I think, than transport, for example, which doesn't get people going to the barricades in quite the same way, even though we've got a system where in London you've got, I wouldn't say fantastic bus network, but relatively it's very good. Elsewhere in the country, hugely expensive and quite poor service. So there's something about the different sectors as well, isn't there, in this? And that's where postcode lottery gets most emotive, I think, in health and the most vulnerable, and where you feel the most vulnerable when you're coming into contact with public services.
I think the other thing is that if you think about where people access, the vast majority of people, not the most vulnerable, but the vast majority of people, the only contact they have with the council is bins. That's the only thing, you pay council to actually get your bins done. If you know that across the way, in the other local authority, they get it twice a week, you get it once a week, you get it once every 2 weeks, they get food recycling and you don't. For the kind of middle voter, that's the thing that peeves people. The free school stuff on top of that, obviously, that again captures that kind of like middle voter kind of thing. But I think we're kind of almost talking about different things here. We're talking about access of services, we're talking about accountability, and we're talking about decision making. And it may not necessarily be that you can get sort of good local access to the services that local area needs, and not necessarily have the accountability lines drawn in the same way, which is kind of what we have at the moment. We have a slightly messy system of decision-making accountability not being clearly transparent through the same channels. So it's important to think about whether they all need to be aligned to have a localism which benefits the most people and actually protect the vulnerable people. I think if you don't have them all aligned, you're likely to have sort of the system where people fall through the gaps. But that then requires sort of some quite significant transfers of structures and operational governance and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. So what do you think it could look like? So you mentioned, Paul, it would be better, actually, for most people if you did have more local decision-making, you had more flexibility locally. And surely you're saying that's what happens anyway. In practice, people don't know. But
People aren't aware, but that's the thing, yeah.
But that happens. How do you think, so moving away from the emotive term postcode lottery, how do you think difference, perhaps, postcode democracy, innovation, how might that be better? And then how can we go back to Claudia's points about, well, okay, what might that mean then to make sure you don't have people falling through the gaps? And how might you start aligning it? And what are those kind of transformations? What do you think might be good about it, as well as less good, which is vulnerable people falling through?
Well, I think if you get to a situation where people this is the first step, people are much more aware of the very, very visible differences that already are, which they're clearly not. Whenever you talk about variation, we mentioned the NHS, that you get the old lurid story about people travelling from Wales to relatives in England in order to access services here. You also get it within regions. There are cancer drugs available in one area, there aren't in the other. That's why the cancer drugs fund has been set up, basically. This sort of thing happens all the time. Middle class people you mentioned. You look at schools, moving areas to try and get their kid into a decent school. So the real first step is just to basically make everyone aware of the massive differences. And then I think you'd get a lot more clarity around this debate about, well, who's responsible therefore for these massive differences, and a lot of them do track to local authorities or local institutions, and you know, in healthcare it will be trusts, and now increasingly it will be local authorities. Then I think we can have a much clearer debate about who, you know, at the end of the day, people will know what's available, what's it like, and who do I complain to if I can't get what I need.
Yeah.
So I mean, and the reason I agree with you that it is good to have much more local accountability for services is because that's how you can improve them the quickest. But you do need people to understand, you know, what the hell's going on first, and that's the thing. I think politicians have basically, and I'd say actively hidden in the case of some services, and you know, we've already seen there been active masking of variation and total unwillingness to allow people to see what on earth's going on, because it would create huge debates about, I thought this was a service available to everyone, and why is it so poor? You know, and it does cause crises.
I think that's the kind of accountability line, that if you actually say differences are okay, as long as you have the power locally to change them, isn't it? So it's, you know, if you say, you know, most people are not particularly geographically mobile. You know, you have your local area that you live, you've got your family and your friends. You don't particularly want to move 100, you know, apart from school side, maybe, you know, go over slightly over, you know, looking from your house. But you don't want to move 100 miles just so you can get that kind of treatment of that thing.
Yeah.
So as long as you have the accountability aligning with those differences, where you can say, yes, it's different here, and if you don't like it, this is how you fix it, this is how you complain, this is how you vote, this is how you change it, so you get the thing that your neighbouring local authority has that you want.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the pressure to improve. That's what companies, you know, Tesco's and Marks and Spencer compete on providing this thing. I don't say services are like supermarkets, but you know, it's that pressure that if you're aware that one provides a better service than the other, you go to that one, don't you? And you can't do that if you're poor and you can't move house to put your kid in a decent school. But it's that accountability, that pressure from consumers. I always talk people using services consumers, because that's the kind of pressure you want to see on services.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about how to actually improve those services, there are only very limited circumstances in which the power of the centre, the equalising centre, is actually going to make sufficient difference. So when we've got examples about services which have really improved, there's been a role for the centre. So if you look at education improvement, the clarity that you talked about in terms of understanding the total picture and what can be expected and what should be expected, that's a role for the centre. But actually meeting those standards, making that improvement. If you look at London Challenge, probably the most single impressive example of school improvement, that's around working locally with local practitioners and communities to understand what your strengths are and make the differences which you want to make. So an assumption that the centre can make it better, can make it work, can guarantee you at the end of the day the type of services that you want, I think is limiting. It doesn't let the centre off the hook, but it does actually say that there needs to be a local centre, there needs to be action locally, and that's really where the difference will be made, in those relationships, in those differences.
So it's really changing the conversation is a lot of what we're talking about. So being transparent about what's really happening, whether the centre. So it's interesting. We are a really centralised country. I think New Zealand is more centralised than us, but otherwise, and that's 4 million people. Otherwise, we're incredibly centralised, and it's a country where we do talk about it as if the Secretary of State can sort this stuff out. So I suppose what we're talking about really is changing that conversation. But that sense of universal outcomes, universal standards. I mean, is that something that you see running through? Because then you can get into the conversation about, well, how do you define it? So is it an outcome that you agree? Is that what we're talking about really? Is it something as specific as waiting times? Is it even more specific about not just the waiting times, but how you get waiting times down and how you deal with things? And what do you think would work best in this kind of culture where it is about consumers having some more knowledge?
Well, I think if you look at what people think, and RSA have done a lot of work on this, going back to 2010 with public services work and surveying people. I've done a lot of focus groups on public services, and it's very clear people do, when you talk about public services, people do think the government are to blame or to be held to account for them. So going back to my earlier point about that, therefore the government doesn't want to actually expose the fact that there's tons of variation. But in terms of kind of how you can push that agenda forward, I think there is always a good role for the centre in ensuring that when you do devolve services and accountability to local areas, that there are broad national aims that you want met. So, reduction in waiting times is a perfectly reasonable thing to push from the centre, as are, increases in cancer diagnosis or more people in social care, better educational standards, whatever. But it's the way that they then meet them, that's the key thing for localities. And so the government will always be held to account for the state of our schools and the state of our economy or whatever. But I think we're seeing increasingly that locally led, and there's announcements today about the economy, locally led solutions do, as you said earlier, do tend to kind of produce better outcomes than centrally defined ones. Because what we've seen in the past, I think, is when you get centrally defined outcomes targets, remember whatever they were called, the big public set performance targets that used to put,
service agreements.
people just go for meeting the target, they don't go for, my particular problem in my area is that older people aren't employed. We've got a massive population of older people, so our work programmes need to be tailored to that. They don't, they just meet the X number of job interviews per 100 people or whatever. And that's the key thing to me. It's centrally dictate where we want to, where we're sort of looking, the horizon we're looking, but in order to get there, you devolve it locally, and that means budgets as well.
Yeah. And I think one of the problems with previous local targets that were set were you set your target and then they proliferated because they broken down into a set of sub-targets and a set of sub-targets because actually they didn't like the idea of setting a single outcome.
Yes.
And then the process on how to get it is sort of that's down to you to innovate and have local professional discretion, all that kind of stuff. That kind of sets pulse racing, in central departments. So the idea you say, well, our outcome is to achieve, a particular waiting time target, but we don't want you to do that by doing X because that would look bad on something else, and then you end up kind of picking out, and you end up basically with 482 separate mini targets when you started with 4 big ones.
Yeah. And within that you can do whatever you like.
Yeah, within that. And that's that kind of centralising impulse, but you can kind of understand because as a nation we like the we have a National Health Service, that's part of our psyche, and we have a national curriculum, that's kind of part of our psyche. And we expect, as kind of a UK citizen sort of settlement, that wherever we go, we're entitled to these things, that we get a GP, and we get, when we go to school, we know we get our 3 Rs and all this kind of traditional stuff. So I think it's important that that the centre can kind of appease public concerns about there is a settlement, there are a set of outcomes that you are entitled to regardless of where you live, but how you get there needs to be open to innovation and public, local variation, because obviously how you might get there, the best stuff that happens is usually when people are sort of given that end goal and say, right, based on your local assets, your local resources, your local voluntary sector, your local traditions, because you're a mining town or whatever, this is how you go about doing it. And that's usually where the best interesting stuff happens, that local government goes, oh, that's central government goes, oh, that's a beacon, or that's a thing, and try and replicate it everywhere else. It doesn't work everywhere else, because the whole point is it's a local innovation. Yeah. So I think that end goal thing is the kind of key.
And I think that point that actually perhaps this is the only way to do it, which I think is implicit. I mean, we don't have centralised culture, lots of targets, but I don't think we've ever had universal standards where that means precisely the same everywhere, because not least because these services are run by people. I liked your term postcode democracy, because I think that's quite an interesting way of, you're right, rethinking this and rethinking what is this and how does it work.
Yes, well, I think that there's one of the ironies is that we are so attached to the idea of an equal service, whereas we are one of the most unequal societies. Yeah. So it clearly hasn't delivered on at least some of the aspirations behind that that uniform good intention. There are ways of aligning policy so that it is more outcome-based without signing up to an SNP manifesto. I mean, Scotland has been precisely going down this route for the past 5 years, and actually having a national outcome framework, and then working in a very ordered, perhaps in other ways entirely successful way, but a very ordered way with its agencies and with local government to understand how the whole architecture can work together better around a sense of outcomes, which is also related to a sense and a culture of human rights, to achieve the sorts of a change that people want to see. So I do think that you can have a centre which is serious about radical change, and whatever else you may say, the SNP government is an example of that. But you don't have to work with centralising levers. You can work through an outcomes framework, actually understand your partners, your public partners, and how they can actually play a role.
And I think this is one of the other interesting things about the debate, because it is very polarising, isn't it? So things like postcode lottery, things like, so it's either got to be national standards or it will be chaos out there. It's either got to be the centre or it's got to be local. And actually, I mean, I think certainly when we go out and talk to people, that's just not how A, it works now, whatever the rhetoric, but B, actually how it can possibly work. And I think in all of the different examples, am I right in thinking that everybody's saying, well, actually it's got to be a bit of both, and it's about getting that balance a little bit better, but also clearer and more obvious to people. So it's not about, okay, it's got to be the town hall, or it's got to be Whitehall. It's about how does this work, the relationship between them, and how do you get that accountability there.
I think it's tricky because we kind of, all of us want kind of the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
The kind of, you know, universal safeguards to make sure people aren't slipping through the net, but at the same time I think all of us have a localising impulse that actually local authorities aren't necessarily responding effectively to local need. Well, we have variation, those aren't necessarily good variations. They are haphazard ones, and usually when things aren't quite working correctly. And I think if it's planned, this sort of postcode democracy, if it's a planned postcode, it's different from the haphazard lottery chaos postcode.
Yeah.
And the planned thing is actually quite tricky because then you have to think about what local skills and capabilities are there to actually do this. If we've hollowed out a lot of our local skills through years and years and years of centralisation, do local authorities have the capacity to now do this? The manpower, the resource, and also just the skill to do it. And then you have a variety of sort of central skills that we can't ignore, sort of professional skills we can't ignore. And we have to think about, what's the perfect size of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
When we're talking about think cities today, we've got cities, we've got local authorities, we've got wards, sort of super output areas, all those kind of different regions. What do we, which is the most effective for which? And if we get to a sense where actually what we're looking at is a middle way, where different sizes are required for different types of services, you have a really complex and confusing regime. But I think it's naturally going to be messy, which is why people prefer the polarising, because it's very obvious. You've got your neat black and white,
Yes.
and the messy stuff in the middle, where it's like, oh, well, it depends on
Yes.
the service, depends on the area, depends on the capacity of the individual community. That just becomes quite a messy scenario.
Yeah, you can hear that on the Today programme, can't you, on politicians being criticised for fudging it. Well, it depends. Whereas actually that's kind of true, I suppose. Yes. Yeah, I mean, is that your view?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, having worked in government, I can see it's, I can understand the tendency towards centralisation kind of thing will fit in one way or another, kind of criticising, but the system of government from Whitehall through to local authority is actually set up with basically central levers in mind. You pull a lever and stuff happens.
Yeah.
And it's purely because of the way the funding runs. Actually, we tax people and we allocate funding, and however much you talk about giving local authorities more powers over certain areas of funding, they're still looking towards the centre for what they should be doing. And if you look at the Localism Act in 2011, for example, and things like the general power of competence, which try to say to people, you can do whatever you want, basically, as long as it's not illegal and as long as it follows general guidance. We want to see you kind of innovating and using new providers to do stuff. And in a lot of areas, it's been fairly disappointing because they do look to the centre, and And this is, I think, the challenge for politicians, and I've always been massively pro-localism on a kind of intellectual level, but very, very sceptical of it from a political one, partly because of experience, but at the end of the day, the big challenge, I think, is that government gets recognition and credit for stuff that it does, and its power is basically spending money and making decisions and making announcements. You know, once you devolve that to other people, that might be a brilliant policy actually, and in fact in many areas it is, and the government should take credit for it, but they don't get the credit for it. The local area does, and if there's an area which shares devolved powers that does nothing, the outcomes are rubbish, you know, it just blames the government for cutting funding. So localism in a recession in particular, and in this very centralised country, as you said earlier, you know, you get all the blame for things that go wrong and none of the credit for things that go right. So I share your view about the need for probably looking more towards a local democratic, building democracy on top of it. So mayors, police commissioners, all of these things that haven't really taken off in this country, that's probably the thing you really want to start pushing. So back to my point about first make people aware of what on earth is going on, then give devolved powers to people and accountabilities, then start devolving funding and service accountability and the rest of it. I often think that we ignore the politics of all of this, which is actually the big thing that stops or makes things work, and we don't get those steps right. And I only think that now in hindsight, of course, but...
you can see they've made their own bed though, because if you think about a lot of things have been devolved in terms of devolving responsibility, but not the actual power to do it. So we're going to devolve the social front here, but you've got to deliver the massive cut at the same time. You know, we're going to give you responsibility to do it and no resources to actually affect change. So you can understand why they're sort of getting the worst of both worlds. They're sort of blamed for the cuts and not credited for the good stuff, because they're handing over the kind of tricky stuff and not giving local authorities actually empowered to do anything about it.
Yeah, it's true.
And I think for all the reasons, the nervousness that you've mentioned, you're right, politics is one of the biggest challenges around this, and it's also feeling the need to do it everywhere at once, because I think that's the other interesting thing about this postcode lottery stuff. It's difficult with public services, particularly health, to devolve some places more than others, but you do pilots. And you know, the work that we do, part of the Think Cities campaign is all about saying, well, you've got to think places, because that's where the jobs are, and the houses, and the people. But some cities have got more capacity than others. Places like Greater Manchester have been building up capacity over a number of years, and they're in a place to be able to do things that perhaps other smaller areas aren't yet. And I think there's an interesting question about if we're going to tackle the politics of this and almost prove this. Because that's often the conversation you have, isn't it? Well, as long as you can prove it works, then we'll do this. And obviously, until you've done it, you can't prove anything. Is there something about, in the politics, kind of trying to get somewhere like Greater Manchester, trying to get some of the mayors that there are to do some of this, to show what could happen in order to pave the way, so you've got a series of steps instead of just giving with one hand, taking with the other, which I suppose part of what you were saying, Paul, you kind of give some of it, but not enough to make this work, and you're kind of holding on to everything all at once.
There are definitely things to be gained from a figurehead, an accountable figurehead, not just a figurehead, with power. But if we come back to politics again, people have felt uncomfortable about voting for local mayors. I think some of that anxiety has been about duplication. This is another layer of politics above the existing politics, rather than a clear explanation of powers going into a different set of hands and local responsibility going somewhere different locally. So I think that still remains a reasonable ambition, but it's actually it's not going to be easy to reach that. And I think there are several levels at which you need to prove that localising decision making can actually make a difference. And one of those, as you say, is looking at the city regions, the big deals, the new structures, the new figureheads. I think that's important to keep on the table and keep pushing it. But I also think that if we're thinking about sustainable public services, and we've mentioned health several times, if we're looking at sustainable health, then looking more and more at intelligent solutions in terms of public health interventions and prevention. And it's there where you can actually become a lot more local, a lot more collaborative with the communities that you're working with, when people can get a real sense that, okay, this is the set of interventions around Salford, and I'm not worried that the set of interventions in Salisbury don't feel this way, that they don't look this way. We have different lives, we do things differently. I think that within public health and within other areas of what you call a demand management approach to making public services effective going forward, those more local relationships are going to be just as important as a new architecture. And I don't think we can wait for new architecture.
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? That we're always waiting for the architecture to be in place. I mean, there's things like the troubled family stuff, where that is much more kind of what you're talking about. It's not on the health side, but putting it around the people rather than putting it around the funding streams, which I think you're right, Sean, is one of the major kind of impediments to this. Different funding streams, different accountabilities. You put things around the people, and you just do what works for them, and it is quite different in Manchester and Essex, and that's okay, and it saves money, not money that goes locally, interestingly. And I think Manchester, 2/3 of the money is from local partners, 80% of the savings go to Wales because of how it's set up. There are challenges around that, but I mean, is that part of it? Because I suppose it sounds quite sensible when you say it like that, but I mean, it's quite a radical rethinking. How do you do this before the architecture? I suppose is my question. How do you, if you think that's the way that we should do it, and you might not, then how do you get moving on that when all the funding is working against you?
Well, it's one of the things I've always been really struck by over the years, looking at the way kind of government works, and the point you alluded to, basically, there are any given social issue, problem, whatever that the government has to spend money on, fixing, dealing, enabling, whatever. There was, for decades we've been told health should be just merged with social care. It's just mad that those are two completely separate issues. Again, looking at employment, well, half the problem for people that are really hard to employ is housing and mental health, yet they're all siloed, And people have been saying this for decades, but nothing really has actually moved in the way of joining that all together. You're right, there are a few kind of experiments, but that's really all they are. They're community pilots, very small scale mergers of health and social care, or you've got city deals where they're giving progressives more powers as long as they show themselves not to or show themselves to be capable of delivering stuff. The big problem is central government and the Treasury. It just will not let go, and and you can kind of understand why. It's taxpayers' money. There's billions and billions of it, and devolution is actually a massive experiment if you really want to make it happen fast. Things will go wrong, and the appetite to not let things go wrong from politicians, again, I'm pointing to politicians as a problem here, that is what is actually stopping it. Unfortunately, I think that kind of progression is way too slow, given the massive pressures our population funding is under, especially with ageing population growth. We do need much more radical change. I'm very, very sceptical of it in the current model of slowly, it's basically earned autonomy, which previous governments did, but it's not working nearly fast enough. And if there are things that are on local level going really well, let's just do it much faster. Collapsing budgets, devolution. I don't know why we have separate fire and police services, for example. I think those things could be done pretty much together, much more efficiently and better. And there's tons of examples, but we've grown as a society. We're very centralised, but the professions themselves within the public sector are also very centralised. They've their own trade unions, their own professional bodies, their own funding, none of which they're willing to give up. So it's actually right back at the centre where the real problems are.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think the kind of health and social care, the integration thing, everyone's been banging on about for 20 years. Probably since the NHS was created, everyone's like, why is social care not in this? In the legislation, there's nothing that stops integration of health and social care at local level. So there are various different local authorities. Everyone talks about the Torquay model, but there's quite a few of them pottering along, happily integrating their stuff, but they're doing it kind of in spite of the fact that you've got a national health service that is 1 million miles away from local social care, and never the train shall meet, and they're sort of budget holding. cost shunting and all this kind of stuff, and sort of cultural issues at the centre. So where local authorities are doing this, the problem is you then have a sort of an NHS reconfiguration, PCGs, health and wellbeing boards, CCGs, all kind of shift around, and a lot of that stuff kind of gets washed out, with the baby in the bathwater, because these things kind of get moved on. So it's kind of happening in spite of that, and that's why the sort of anything that's kind of person-centred is inevitably never going to work unless it's reflected at central level.
Yeah.
So you had in the previous government the kind of Sure Start stuff, which was integrated at central. You had the early years intervention type stuff, social mobility, education, kind of health and that kind of stuff at national level, and that then worked locally. The troubled families thing, because it's got the political will behind it at central level to actually push to make that person-centred strategy, is now working at local level in the sense that the DWP released their data so that local authorities could identify these families, and then all the kind of funding followed the person, and but we're talking about a handful of people that Ian Duncan Smith got being bonnet about, and got pushed the political will at centre to make it happen. But that's one group of people. You need the political will to make it happen across the board for everybody, for everything.
So we're just coming towards the end now, but and I've been struck by how much agreement there's been. I thought there would be and we love a little bit of a debate, but actually it's been interesting, even though people are coming from different kind of perspectives on this because of the different experience you've all got. Actually, I think we're all broadly saying quite similar things, but coming up against this kind of fundamental problem of how do you sort out the politics, the political will. I'd say Whitehall have got their share of the blame as well, to be honest. I think Treasury and others are fantastically good at holding things up where they're worried about risk and other things. But so my final question, I suppose, to you, which is one that I'd be delighted if you can answer, but I'm not necessarily expecting you to be able to, is what do you do then? How do you fix this? If we're saying that you need to get on with it, but it doesn't really work without changing the system, but you can't just wait for the system because we'll be waiting for another 50, 60, 70 years. What next? How do we kind of move forward on this if we all think that actually universal outcome's good, deciding how you do that locally, good, more transparency? What do you do?
Well, I think personally, it's the key to it is trying somehow to take the politics out of it. So localism kind of, to me, seems to stop at local government, which I think in many areas is as bad as central government for politicking, probably even worse. There are really good things happening, largely because people kind of join forces and they're politically aligned, so they do things. The central government has tended to do things with its politically aligned councils, and they kind of work. But it's politics is a big problem. I would like to see things devolve further than local authorities actually getting taken out of it altogether, and commissioning for services done at a local level, but by specialist bodies overseen by independent regulators, much more competition for service delivery, but accountability obviously resting with a political figure, be it a mayor in a region or a Whitehall minister. And just finally, I think the other thing, the extent to which localism will kind of progress, I think, is limited by the fact that we have a unitary system of taxation. I mean, that's the real issue. You talked about health and social care. The reason that really isn't getting integrated is because most of social care is funded by council tax. And no one's got their heads around this idea about how you fund what is essentially just a general health service and organise it without messing up the means by which you fund it. So I don't know a lot of people talk about fiscal devolution, where you've got, that's the real political accountability, when you're responsible for your finances and also balancing the budget, not just getting more and more from central government and spending and getting a deficit. You're actually responsible for cutting a deficit, balancing your budget, not getting into loads of debt. A lot of local politicians are either incapable or unwilling to accept that. And we're a small country, and you can argue it may not be all that necessary, but I think really, at least at the regional level, there is a case for more kind of tax and spend of the kind we're seeing in the Scottish debate, actually, in devolution.
Absolutely.
Having been pessimistic before about the architecture and making that fit for purpose. There are signs that the political conversation is changing, and that's around city regions. It's about growth and the potential agglomeration effects, and etc. etc. I think that should that go forward, that's not just going to have an impact and make a difference within those city regions, and within those particular deals. I think it changes the game more broadly in terms of what people expect to be able to control and the say they think they have over the services which affect their lives locally wherever they are. So I do think the game is possibly changing. As I think I mentioned earlier, yes, Whitehall risk averse, politicians risk averse for good as well as infuriating reasons. But if the status quo can't hold, then there needs to be a change. I don't think that the set of arguments for greater control for city regions currently comes from a sudden welling up within Whitehall for the burghers of Manchester. I mean, this is
I'm
quite,
pretty sure it doesn't.
it's hard-headed stuff about finding solutions that actually fit where we are and where we're going. And I think that the same set of changes and the changes in where the risks lie, I think that applies more generally to the way that health, social care, and other local services and their freedom to be truly local. I think that change will come.
That is hopeful. Claudia, are you hopeful?
Well, I think, as with all of these sort of decentralising things, actually you need to start with the centre and say that they need to have the political will to let go, because we're starting from a base that, we're not starting from something that we've already claimed. We have to claim it as a first. I think the kind of squaring the circle between the kind of political risk and not being able to take credit for the stuff that happens is around central government being able to say that they are guardians of some sort of citizenship settlement. We can claim credit, and we are the guardians of these minimum things that you will get as a citizen wherever you happen to live. Around health, around education, around just general sort of service. And if you're able to have some sort of earned autonomy, or earned fiscal autonomy, and say, actually deliver these outcomes as you can, we'll give you more of your own fundraising spend to do that, and also look at some systematic knowledge transfer between the ones that are doing it well and the ones that are floundering, because we're starting from a very varied base. Some of the big urban centres and some of the ones with a real sort of strong regional and local characteristics and real kind of they don't feel part of London, and they don't see London. They're very distinct, and they do it well, and they sort of have a bigger, some of the elected mayoral areas, doing these things well, to actually transfer the way that they're doing things to some towns in Buckinghamshire that have never really done that before. Trying to get that across and say, these guys are trying to achieve their outcomes this way, and we've given them more money to do it because they're managing really well, and transferring that knowledge around, I think, is going to be key. So I think for me, it's the kind of central outcome and autonomy for the process and how to get there. It's kind of the balance, and that kind of overlays any infrastructure that you happen to have, because you can do it whether you're at sort of local government level or if you're kind of ward level. You can kind of lay it on top of all the messy stuff that we've currently got without having to kind of sweep it all away. So
which I think a lot of it does come back to politics, isn't it? Political will and how much people want this and want to have the conversation, which goes back to right where we started about having a conversation about this, and a different kind of conversation that's not just postcode lottery. So I think everyone's got slightly different views about how we get there and what we do, but there is a common theme around standards, not straitjackets almost. So there is that politicians are the guardians. They talk about the universal outcomes, but it's not a straitjacket for this is exactly how you do it in these ways. There's something about that transparency and information, having that conversation. There's the accountability, funding, decision making, aligning that better, and that's not just aligning it with local authorities necessarily. We're very much in favour of city regions, obviously for some things, not for everything. And I think it is about that messy thing of doing it at different levels. And we've talked about just the politics of it and just getting the politics right. And acknowledging the politics, I think, a bit more than perhaps does happen in some of this, and working out how you deal with it. And then money. And we're very much in favour of fiscal autonomy. It's one of the big things that Think Cities is arguing for. But I think with that does come, as Sean says, some of the risks. And it is about accepting that and seeing how that works in different places, in different ways. But it's a discussion that I think we could easily spend an hour longer on, perhaps two, and never get quite to the end of it. But I think I've found it really useful, very interesting, a lot of kind of important points to take away. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. This is part of a series of Think Cities debates, so I hope you'll watch the other ones as well. I hope you join the campaign, arguing that if you want more jobs, more houses, better public services, you do need to think cities and surrounding areas, because that's where people live. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much to Claudia, to Sean, to Paul, and please do join us again.